Hi, this is Simon Obstill and welcome to this second part of this tutorial for Blackmagic Fusion, in which we're taking a look at creating this. Now, in the first part we looked at the basic mechanics of it, and in this part I'm going to be looking at things like lighting and materials and so on. And in something of a departure from my normal practice, I'm not going to be reading out from a list of predetermined values. I'm going to show you a bit more about how I actually go about arriving at those values. So this is going to be a lot more freeform, and I hope it's going to be useful to you to see my process in action. And as you'll see, a lot of it is about balancing one element off against another and then just keep revisiting your choices till you've got something that works for you. So anyway, let's make a start on this. So this is where we left things last time around, and I think the first thing I want to do is I want to add a floor. So I'm going to add a new 3D shape, and plane is what I want. So I'm going to pipe it into this 3D merge here, and let's come to transform. Let's rotate it through -90 on X, and let's set its scale to 7.5. And just to verify its vertical position, I'm actually going to move it up until we just can't see the lights like that, and then add a negative sign to the front of that. There's probably a complicated sum I could have done, but hey, let's just do it the simple way. Then I'm going to come to the material, and just for the time being, I'm just going to make this black, so it's going to be easier to understand what's going on here. So I also want a cyc for the background, so I'm going to add another 3D shape, pipe it into the merge. I'm going to set this one to cylinder, and I'm going to set its visibility to cull faces front. So that just chops off the front there. Let's increase that radius till it sort of covers the frame like that, and then let's go for a height of sort of 10, so it's plenty big enough. And that's just going to take care of anything in the background there. So I've renamed those two as cyc and floor. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new point light. So 3PL, and add it to the merge. Then to this point light, I'm going to add a 3D duplicate. So let's come to the duplicate and have 4 copies and a Y rotation of 90. Now, because the light is dead center, we're not actually seeing any result of using that 3D duplicate. So what we need to do is come to the transform and use our good old friend square root of 2. So sqrt, open brackets, 2, close brackets, divided by 2. And then let's copy that and then paste that into the Z field. And now you can see how those are working. I'm going to turn off this original point light because it's confusing things a little bit. And then I'm also going to adjust the vertical position of that point light till we just get something like that. So something like -0.6 is probably quite good. Now, as you see, they're not actually lining up with the cube, the big cube, and obviously I'm wanting them to come off these corners. So what I'm going to do is, after that 3D duplicate, I'm going to add a 3D transform, and I'm going to select the large and that new 3D transform, and making sure I can see both their Y rotations. I'm going to add an expression to the Y rotation of that transform and pick whip the large value like so. And then it's going to follow the movement, as you can see, but it's not following the angle, and to do that we just need to add 45 degrees to the end of that, so plus 45, and now you can see it's sitting neatly on the corners and following the animation. So then we can do the same thing for the middle cube, which needs its own lights on its corners. So we can take these 3 nodes, Command C, Command V, and let's pipe the output of this new transform into there. Obviously, with this transform, we're going to change the large to small, because obviously we want to follow the rotation of the small cube, but we also want to adjust the corners so they're much closer in. So what we're going to do is have to come back to this transform here on this new point light, and this value here for X and Z needs to be the square root of 2 divided by 4. So let's do that. sqrt, open brackets, 2, close brackets, divided by 4. And let's do the same thing for the X, sqrt, open brackets, 2, close brackets, divided by 4. And now you can see they're neatly attached to the corners of the small box. But I think in this case we want the source to be higher up. So I'm just going to eyeball this really, just move it up a little bit till I get something I like. So where it's sort of negative 0.5 or something, 0.55, just a little bit higher than those other ones. So what I think we want to do with these lights is make them a little bit green. So let's do that. So I'm just going to increase that saturation. I've got this hue set to 120 there. Just a little bit of saturation is going to give me a nice little green light there. Let's do the same with the other one. Hue is 120. Just adjust that saturation. If you don't want to overdo this, it wants to be pretty subtle. So something like that, 10% saturation. And then I'm also going to re-enable that original point light and just move it out on X to something like -2, up on Y to 1.5, and maybe -1.5 on Z. And I think I'm also going to just really bring its intensity down. Let's go for something like 0.3, and let's copy it, paste it, add it to the merge. And this copy, let's move over to the other side. So let's have it at 2 on X, and maybe just 0 on Z. Now we're picking up the cyc, and I don't think I want that. So what I'm going to do is come down and come into its material and simply reduce its specular intensity down to nothing. Also just set its color down to black. And so basically it'll just be a sort of nice black hole at the back. So now let's think about some materials. I'm going to come back to my original shape here, the one that's creating the box. And I'm going to bring in an asset. So loader, from my assets folder, I'm going to bring in scratched metal. And then I'm going to add a blin. And then I'll take the output of the blin into the shape. I'm also going to add a luma keyer, pipe the output of scratched metal into the luma keyer. And then the output of that I'm going to add to the specular intensity input of the blin. And come back to the blin, and let's adjust its diffuse color down quite a lot. And let's come to its specular, and again set its specular color down a little bit, like that. Let's zoom in here so we can see what's going on. And you can see we've got this nice sort of texturing on the cylinders. So we can adjust the intensity of that with this luma keyer now. Just crunch it in a bit if we choose, something like that. And, just the intensity using the color of the diffuse. We could brighten up the color of the diffuse. I think we want to keep it fairly dark like that. And again, the color of the specular, we can just adjust to taste. I think we were pretty good to start with, but you can see how pushing it back towards white gives us brighter specular highlights. So let's now actually look at the floor. And again, I'm going to add a loader, and in my assets folder, I'll look for concrete mashup, bring that in. In this instance, I'm going to add a Cook Torrance shader, pipe that into the floor. So for the diffuse color, again, let's just really bring that down. We don't really want much of that at all, like something like 20% brightness. So then again, let's also add a luma keyer in order we can get the specular highlights. So concrete mashup into luma keyer output into the specular intensity of the Cook Torrance. So that's looking quite good. Let's maybe just bring that color back up again just a little bit. So the nice thing about the Cook Torrance is if we open up the specular is we've got this roughness and the Fresnel and so on. So I'm going to turn off Do Fresnel because I don't actually want that, and turn down the roughness, which obviously makes it shinier. Maybe just reduce that specular intensity down a little bit. So I think my cyc is much too small. I don't know what's gone wrong here. I'm going to increase that scale to, 5. Just push it well out of the way. I also want to add a bump map. So bump map node, take the concrete mashup output of that into the bump map, take the output of the bump map into the bump map input of the Cook Torrance. That's kind of giving us a bit more texture on the floor. So adjust that to taste, maybe 1.5, I think. So that's the floor set up. That's looking quite good, I think. Now, there's another element to this scene that I think makes it really rather nice. And that's that I added some sort of glass to these cubes. And to add that glass, I'm going to come to this 3D merge here before we kind of divided and made the large and small cubes. And I'm going to add a new 3D shape. And I'm going to set it to cube. And because our cube at this point is still 1 by 1 and we haven't scaled it up, the default cube now fits perfectly. So again, let's add a loader because I want to create a material for this, a nice glass. And let's add the very dirty glass. And I think I'm going to use a cook torrents again for this. So then pipe the output of the cook torrents into the shape, 3D shape. You can see that glass, that rough texture being applied. Let's reduce the opacity of this, maybe just go for something like 0.5. I'm guessing at these numbers, but you can see how that's given us a little bit of that kind of glass effect. Again, let's add that luma keyer. It's all important to give us our specular, very dirty glass into the luma keyer, and then the output of that into the specular intensity. So coming over to the cook torrents and its specular. Again, let's reduce its roughness maybe, and let's undo do for an L, I think, again. So just get that value of the roughness to the point where we're kind of seeing quite a lot of that glass. And I think that is, for me, is probably looking quite nice. Actually, we can still see it and it's not too intrusive. I think that's good. So I think I want a little bit more kick off my side lights. So come to that point light there. That's the one on the left. Just bump it up. You see as I do that, we're seeing a bit more of the glass on the top of the cube here. One thing I want to address is these spheres on the corner of the cube. So I'm going to come back to that sphere shape. And again, let's just, with our hue set to 120, let's just give them a little bit of saturation. So they've got a bit of green in them. And I also think the size is a little bit too much. So let's come over to the controls. We had 0.05 for the radius. I think I'm going to go for 0.04. I think that looks a little bit nicer. I'll maybe split the difference. 0.45. Yeah, I like that. And those ribbons, you remember we had a replace material for the ribbons. And I think we want to reduce that saturation quite a lot on the diffuse colour, down to around 15%. I kind of want them fairly bright. Don't want to overdo this whole green thing. So then I want to add in a glow. So I'm going to take my 3D renderer here. To it, I'm going to add a basic blur. The blur looks like that. And let's increase that blur size. Let's go for something like 10. And let's knock back the blend to around 0.5. What I actually want to do before doing that is add a luma keyer. So after the renderer, to add a luma keyer. And what that's doing is it's kind of picking out just the bright bits, and that's going to work better for us than if we're kind of blurring the whole scene. So then we can use the luma keyer controls to kind of push through the bits that we want. So if we're picking up a bit of the floor as well, I think that's probably not necessarily a bad thing. And then we can recomposite that back over the top of our main output. So I'm going to add a basic merge, pipe the renderer output into that merge, pipe the blur into the merge, look at the result, and then take the alpha gain and reduce that to 0. And then what I also want to do is on the end of the blur is add a brightness contrast, and then clip both the black and the white and probably reduce the saturation of that. So as always with something like this, you need to balance one thing off against another. So when you make one change, you need to think about whether the changes you made before are still working. And I think having pushed up that point light too much, it's just dominating the floor. The floor is dominating too much. And I'm going to bring that down. But I might actually just also try to switch the decay type to linear. And that's probably a better answer, because then it's going to hit the glass, but it's not going to hit the floor so hard. You can see the difference that makes. It's quite considerable. And if we just want a little bit more, we can just play with that decay rate. So what is left to do? We need to animate the camera, I think, probably at this point. So I've set my timeline range to be 480. So the first thing I want to do with my camera is I want to open up the pivot and I want to add an expression to the Z, something I always like to do, and then pick whip the Z translation value and then apply a negative sign to the front of that. And what that means is that any rotation is going to be about the center of the scene, and that makes life a lot easier for us. So I'm just going to, at frame 240 here, I'm going to add some keyframes for both the translation and the rotation. So right click here on translation, animate translation group, do the same thing for the rotation, animate rotate group. We set keyframes for everything. So then I think obviously we need to come down a bit on Y, maybe pull out a little bit more on Z. What I also want to do is to rotate around on Y, so we're more or less looking at the cube front on. So I think not completely, so let's go for 35. And then let's come back to the beginning, and here let's push in on Z, so we're seeing right into the cube like that. And then let's adjust that X rotation. We're probably a little bit too close here. And let's pull out a bit. That's probably quite a nice starting point there. And then let's come to the end. And I think I actually want to be looking down even more. So I'm going to adjust my X rotation till we're looking down, something like that. Bit of a tweak to the Y and the Z. But actually, I think it's that X rotation we need to have more of. Let's go for something like this. So I think that camera move is going to be pretty good. So then let's come to the spline editor and make sure we've got show only selected tool. Select all the keyframes, zoom out so we can see everything, select them all, Shift S to make them all smooth. I'm not going to waste time sort of finessing those. I think those are probably going to be just fine as they are. So then the final thing to do, apart from a few more extra tweaks I think I might want to do on the look of it, is to ramp the rotation of the two cubes. So this is going to be quite interesting. So I'm going to come back to that large transform there, and then I'm going to copy that expression, Command C, and then I'm going to remove the expression, and then I'm going to right click and modify with expression. And this is going to allow us to do what we want to do. So then I'm going to come over to the modifiers tab, and then I'm going to add an expression to N1, and I'm going to paste the expression that I copied into there. And so instead of that 60 degrees, I'm going to have N2 for that value. So I can use N2 to set the degrees of rotation. So I'm going to come to frame 240, and then I'm going to keyframe that value, and I'm going to set it to 90. Then I'm going to come to frame 60, and I'm going to set that to 0. And then let's also come to 420 and set that back down to 0. So then what I need to do is I need to come over to the number out and type N1, so that the number out is going to be driven by the N1 expression. So then what's going to happen is that the cube is going to stay static for the first 60 frames. As you can probably see, the only movement is actually the camera. And then gradually from 60 frames onwards, it's going to start its own rotation. You can probably see that starting to happen now. So you can see that starting to swing, and then it'll get to the middle, achieve its maximum rotation, and then it'll ramp back down again gently towards the end. So then, making sure we've got our large selected, let's come to the spline editor, and number in 2 is the value that we want. Let's select all the keyframes for that, Shift S to smooth them out, and we just need to do the same for the small, but in the case of the small, I'm going to have it start its ramping right from the beginning. So let's come to the small, let's copy its expression, let's remove that expression, let's right click, modify with expression, let's come over to modifiers, let's add an expression to N1, let's paste in the copied expression, let's replace 60 by N2, let's come to number out and make sure to set that to N1. And let's come back over here. So again, at frame 240, I actually want a larger rotation here, I think. So keyframe it. Let's set this to be maybe 120 even. And let's come back to frame 0 and set that to 0, and come to the end and set that to 0. And then let's do exactly the same thing with the spline editor. Number in 2 is the thing we need to affect. So select all those keyframes and Shift S. And then if we want, we can maybe just ramp that in even more. Maybe do the same in the out. Doesn't have to be exactly the same. So it'll now actually begin with both cubes static, but the middle cube is starting to do its rotation first. It's already started to be quite active, and then it's kind of jiggles the other one into motion. And so we're pretty much there, I think. The only thing I'm not quite happy with still is those blobs on the corners, the spheres on the corners. Might just do something to try and just tame that down a little bit. What could we do? We could just kind of come to this brightness maybe and just reduce that a little bit. So I was really winging it here in order to be able to show you that it's a process, and you need to kind of go backwards and forwards. Again, I think probably that light is a little bit too much. That point light. Let's, as a final thing, let me just adjust that again. You see, I've actually come back, and I'm revisiting even this decision. So leave the decay rate where it was, I think, and then just reduce that intensity. I want to be able to see that glass, but I don't want that highlight to be too strong. So here's a render of what we've just done, and actually I'm fairly happy with it. I do like the shine we're getting off the glass. I think it's just about right. So we're seeing plenty of it. It's not really obscuring too much. I like it. Not sure I like the floor too much, but overall I think that's been pretty effective. So anyway, I think that's probably me done. Thanks very much indeed for watching. I hope to see you again soon.